Hey everyone, welcome to the seventh episode of Edgar Church's Basement, a collectible comics podcast from me, Rob Larson. I run a YouTube channel and a blog, youtube.com/itsallJustComics and itsallJustComics.com. On those venues, I share, research, auction reviews, previews, historical deep dives into the history of the hobby, to the history of certain books, to the history of certain pedigrees, etc. This podcast is a companion to that work where I can talk about comics in a more general way, right? So I have been doing some kind of project work here on the podcast, talking about the most valuable comics in the world and trying to put together a list of the top 10 most important / most valuable / coolest pre-hero comic books. And both of those took 3 episodes each. This 7th episode is not going to be project-based. So I've been kind of promising that I would do less project-based work and just kind of talk about comics randomly here on the podcast. And I finally am doing that fully with this 7th episode. Although, spoilers, it may turn into one, right? So the topic for today is one that I talk about a lot on the YouTube channel because I often go through, auctions, upcoming auctions. And then I say, wow, this is a cool book. And I say, oh, this thing sold for X in, 2022 or 2023. And then it sells for a lot less in 2025. And one of the things that, we all know, or maybe we don't all know, but a lot of people that have been involved with the hobby for a while know that there are boom and bust cycles. And, if you're paying attention, you know that there was a boom cycle during the heart of COVID. So kind of mid 22 to, kind of the end of 2023 or something like that. And actually, just as an aside, that's one of the things that if I continue to research this topic, and I will talk about some of the ideas that I have for researching it, one of the things will be to actually identify, like, what is that bubble period? Like, what started it? Like, what are the big results at each end? And just try and put a framework around it so that I can then do some more analysis of results, right? So, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The result that really pushed this discussion was the White Mountain copy of Fantastic Four #1 CGC 9.2, selling for what is in every sense a respectable $600,000, right? And, that's on the heels of a Fantastic Four #1 CGC 9.6 selling for over $2 million, which is a great result for that book. The problem there is that we have, one of the biggest bubble results, I think, which is the Fantastic Four #1 CGC 9.2 that sold for $1.5 million, which is a crazy result. I love Fantastic Four #1, so like if it's going to happen to any book, I'd like it to happen to that. That result defies gravity. So when you have a result like that sitting in the middle of your kind of analysis, it throws everything off. And in reality, what I did is just ignored it. I mentioned it. I talked about it in the video, but, in terms of analyzing the price and how it stood up, to the long-term historical trends and, even recent trends outside of that book, that looked like a pretty good result, but it's less than half of what, that other 9.2 sold for just a few years ago. So, and there are plenty of results like that. So just to set the stage, I'm going to run through a few of those results now to kind of give you a sense of what I've been working with and what I've been seeing as I've done analysis of current auctions, but against their, previous results, as well as just research into some stuff from the past few years. As I have mentioned a little bit, partially it was because there was a bubble happening and it was just too much for me to deal with. And partially because I just had some things going on in my life that required my attention. I wasn't paying as much attention to comics as I would have liked over that kind of 2023 to 2024 period. So the end of the bubble. And then, before I started up the YouTube channel where I really started getting back into research, kind of full time. And so I had to catch up with some data. And one of the things that happened is I was catching up with data and I would find a result from 2023 that I hadn't captured. And then, I captured the serial number and I'm going through and I'm researching later auctions and I would see the same serial number pop up and it would be like a 50% loss, right? It would just be an absolute bloodbath. And there are a lot of those. So, and, and they happen in auctions all the time. So, yeah. So let's go through a few that I've run into. I'll share them just to give you some context about like why this is such a problem, and it is a problem. And it's not just like statistically a problem. It's a problem for the hobby because, well, I'll talk about it. Let me just set the stage and then I'll do a little bit more discussion. One of my favorites, if you can call it that, is a copy of Hero for Hire #1 CGC 9.8, which sold for $102,000 in 2022. Before that, the previous high had been in 2016, but was still only $24,000. A copy had sold in 2020 for $16,250. So to jump to $102,000 is pretty crazy. The book has since halved, the last two copies selling for $48,000 and $49,000 respectively, which is actually one of those things that I want to talk about. Is the long-term trend is actually good. We've gone from 16,000 to 48,000 and 49,000 in 2024 and 2025 respectively. It's just that you have this like spike in the middle of the data in 2022. And it looks terrible, right? Like if you're the purchaser of that book from 2022 and you're looking at a $48,000 sale, you're not too happy about what you paid in 2022. So, but that's one example that's come up a couple of times because I quite like this book. So it's kind of a bummer that his first appearance is one of the poster children for this kind of bubble result. So we have an example from the Silver Age. We have an example from the Bronze Age. Let's take a look at an example from the Golden Age, from one of the top books in the hobby, which you think would be immune to this sort of thing, but they're certainly not. Tuesday, December 14th, 2021. Comic Connect sold CGC 3.0 Action Comics #1 for $1,638,759.20. A copy in that grade, thankfully not the same copy. So that copy is still in somebody's collection, which is good. Another copy of that book in that grade, which I covered on my YouTube channel, sold for $960,000. So that's not quite as bad a loss as you would see with the Hero for Hire #1 book, which is selling for less than half of what it used to sell for, but that's still a pretty big drop. And that's not even the only mega key that has seen a similar result. The next one was featured in one of the most popular videos on my YouTube channel, in which I talk about the biggest cash loss in comics history. The title holder for that is Tales of Suspense, CGC 9.8, Tales of Suspense 39. That is CGC 9.8, which lost like $1.2 million. It sold for like $2 million at Comic Link and then sold at auction for like $875,000 or something like that. Those numbers are off, but you get the gist. But a couple of other books that I covered in that video were also, big cash losses. And this is one of them. And it hurts because this is Detective 27. Detective 27, CGC 4.5, January 13th, 2022. Detective Comics #27, CGC 4.5, serial number 27066790001, sold for $1,140,000. 2 years later, June 20th, 2024, it sold back at Heritage for $675,000, which is not a good result. As promised, the next book we're going to look at is a Copper Age book, Deadpool, first Deadpool. New Mutants 98. We're going to look at 9.9 and 9.8. 9.9 is much more straightforward because it mirrors what you see with Hero for Hire #1. The last copy before the pandemic sold in 2017 for $11,700. That's CGC 9.9 copy, by the way. In February 2021, a copy sold for $42,000. So that's a pretty big increase in 4 years. In 2023, a copy sold at Comic Connect for $40,250. That exact same copy was resold earlier this year at Heritage for $24,000. So again, it's similar to kind of that Detective 27 in terms of percentage loss, but is a pretty big drop from what the buyer paid for it in 2023. Thanks to GPA, I can look at the results for 9.8 in aggregate, right? So they have kind of a moving average, high-low bands that their chart shows, which is interesting, but they actually have a moving average in the middle, and they can tell me what the average price is for a range. So looking at the last 5 years, starting in the end of 2020, so this is before things started to go crazy, the average price for a CGC 9.8 copy of New Mutants 98 was $938. The price range was between $800 and $1,100. By March of 2021. So this is kind of where things started to go crazy. The average price had tripled in months to $2,460. The price range went from $800 to $1,100 to $1,914 to $3,000, which is a pretty big jump. That's a hockey stick right there for you. And since then, it has dropped steadily. So if you look at the most recent results, that average price was the highest average price was $2,460 in March of 2021, and the average price right now, as of this recording, July of 2025, is $1,057. So it's gone down by, again, just a huge amount. And of course, individual copies in there have probably seen pretty bad losses as well. So yeah, this is another book that has, and this one is not just outliers. It's not just like a random spike sale. You actually had hundreds of sales that were in this kind of bubble phase, and the price has dropped out significantly. And as much as like some old timers might not like Rob Liefeld or Deadpool or New Mutants or whatever, this is a book that people covet. And yeah, so if this is seeing losses like this, it's the kind of thing that, if I do end up doing more analysis of it, I expect to see across kind of all the big popular books. And so, yeah, so that just sets the stage a little bit. This isn't, obviously is not a complete re-examination of all the, good, bad, and ugly sales from the pandemic, but it's just to set some things up, right? Big books, the kind of bread and butter of the hobby, sold for a bunch of money during the pandemic bubble, and then are selling for much less now. So why does all of this matter? It doesn't really. Like, at the end of the day, it's just comics. And hopefully people are spending money on comics that they can afford to lose. And if not, hopefully they're, not in the poorhouse because they lost some money on an Action Number 1 or whatever. Although that would be a really dumb reason to end up in the poorhouse. I bought an Action Number 1 and now I've been kicked out of my house. Not a great story. Although I've thought about it. Not actually getting kicked out of my house, but selling my house just for that one time to have a Detective 27. It would have been Detective 27. No. My wife would divorce me if I bought an Action 1, but Detective 27, that'd be fine. She would divorce me anyway. But back to the topic at hand. So why does this matter, right? Like, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't. There's a lot going on in the world, and comics are just a hobby, and I love them, but it's fine. People can lose money. No one's going to cry. And that's true. That remains true, even though I'm about to say the opposite, right? But it does matter. It does matter because, and this has happened. I've seen this twice that I really paid attention to. But it's also happened in other times, right? So, books fall in and out of favor. So there are trends. So there's that, right? So you can be sitting on something like, we see this all the time. Marvel Comics number 1 was an absolute dog for the entire 2000s, right? It set the record for the highest price paid for a comic book, and then every result for that book was disappointing for 10 years. But that's different. So the entire hobby taking a haircut is rarer, although it does happen. So the first time was kind of the variant modern Image second indie boom in the early 1990s. So a ton of books sold for a lot of money right out the gate. One that I bought and sold a lot of boxes of was New Mutants 87. But you would have things like, that glow-in-the-dark Ghost Rider cover and the glow-in-the-dark Hulk second printing, and Spider-Man number 1, multiple printings, and the platinum issue, and then, 5 different covers of Legends of the Dark Knight, and X-Men number 1 with 5 different covers, and all that kind of stuff. And you had the, Valiant books, and just all of these new books were just going through the roof. And if CGC had been around at that point, things would have been even crazier. But they were crazy. And then that just all kind of died off. And the comic hobby, was kind of aimless for a little while there, because a lot of interest and a lot of money had been drained out of it because no one was buying those things anymore. And it took a long time for some of those books, which are still collectible and still very cool, to recover. And then, of course, there's the early CGC bubble. So when CGC came on the market, which is funny because if you look at those results now, they look cheap. Even the quote bubble results from the early 2000s. But the early 2000s, we didn't really understand what the population was like. We didn't really understand how many books were out there, how difficult some books were to be, graded in 9.8 for newer books or 9.6 or 9.4. And so people overpaid, and it just drove a lot of money into the hobby at that time because you could make money and you could just be like the first person to grade, um, you know, Daredevil 168 CGC 9.8, and you would make, $900 for a book that cost $50 when you bought it. And, and then, so you had all these like exuberant prices very early on. And, and we also had the Spider-Man hype at that same period. So that first Spider-Man movie came out around that time and books went crazy. And there was actually a bloodbath auction. So somebody who, I always forget the story. I think the guy had a divorce, like was getting a divorce, and he had spent like, I don't know, $500,000 on Spider-Man comics. And the wife was like, I need that money. And so they had to sell them at Heritage. And they sold them. And it was just a terrible, terrible series of results because he had bought into the height of the hype. So we had the CGC hype, and we also had the Spider-Man hype. And this guy bought into the middle of that and then had to sell prematurely and just lost a ton of money. But that was fine. Like eventually, like you recover from those things. We recovered from the early 90s. We recovered from that kind of early CGC, hype bubble. And then 20 years later, we get this kind of COVID, Bitcoin, stimulus infused crazy period. And we're still at the point where we're recovering from that, right? And so again, at the end of the day, it's like, it doesn't really matter. Like, well, it's, we'll get out of this. Eventually, the hobby will work its way past these results, and these results won't look crazy anymore. I mean, they'll look crazy in comparison to results around them, but someday, one day, that CGC 9.2 Fantastic Four #1 will sell for $3 million, and no one will care that it sold for $1.5 million, and it was a crazy result. But, we're living today. The hobby is today. And so people look at results like, and I'm sharing them. Like, I don't hide them. I actually like to call them out. So, and I'm supposed to be like, I want the hobby to do better. I love comics. I would like the high end of the hobby to do better as well, right? So this is like, goes against what I actually want to have happen, but I'm not going to hide, bad results just to make the hobby look good. And so we have to face up to these things. And it's every auction. I find something that was bought for some ridiculous amount of money in 2021 or 2022 and sold for 40% less recently. So that doesn't help, right? That doesn't help get new collectors into the hobby when they look and see that things have gone crazy. And then they're not so crazy, and now people are losing their money. So it's useful to understand it. It's useful to be able to face up to it as a hobby, to talk about it, acknowledge it, and say, well, some of these things are they've gone too far in the other direction, right? Maybe they're bargains now. They may not be. I mean, I think one of the things that I do really want to evaluate is whether or not the prices paid now are above the long-term trends, like what you would expect these books to have. If there wasn't a COVID bubble, where would you expect New Mutants 98 and 99 to be? Is it $24,000? Is it twice what it was in 2016? That's actually probably right. Like, I'm just spitballing, but I think that that's actually a reasonable number. It's more than doubled in 8 years. So if you ignore the two $40,000 sales, that book's fine. If you look at New Mutants 98 and CGC 9.8, which I don't have in front of me, but maybe that trend line is correct, right? The current, whatever it's worth, an average $1,000 in 9.8 is where it should be, because there's a ton of them, and it should basically be flat growth. I don't know. I mean, there's nothing with that book. There's nothing like driving the price. Deadpool movies have already happened. Everyone that knows who he is, there's no ready-made bump, right, for that. So, and that's fine. Some of these books stay flat. But so that's one piece of analysis that I actually would like to do. So anyway, that digression about trend lines and potential bargains aside, I mean, that's the thing, is you just have to face it head on and acknowledge that it happened, and try to evaluate, as collectors in the hobby, you have to evaluate what you're buying based on what you think it's worth now, right? You can't necessarily look and say, "Oh gosh, this thing sold for $1.2 million, 4 years ago," and think that that's gonna tell you something about what it's gonna sell for now. It doesn't work that way anyway. Comics aren't precise. I mean, I do my best, and I have some foundation in understanding how this stuff works, and I still like throw darts. I wave my hands in the air and go, you know, chant incantations and come up with numbers sometimes because you just don't know. And especially at the high end when there's so few sales, there's so few potential buyers. You can't really predict how things are going to go. And that's it. So you just kind of have to, if you're buying something these days, you kind of have to try and figure out what it's worth now, and you have to ignore data that maybe isn't going to help you. And if you're selling, you certainly have to ignore some of that data, right? Like if you're looking to sell something and you didn't even need to buy it during the pandemic, if you bought it 15 years ago and you have a Fantastic Four #1 CGC 9.2 that you bought for $100,000 in 2010. I'm not sure if that number is realistic, but whatever. Um, and you're looking to sell it now. I mean, the thing that you want to compare it to, and you're not going to make that much money because it is the White Mountain copy and it's got a certain cachet. Is the White Mountain copy. It's not that $1.5 million sale. So if you're disappointed because you don't make $1.75 million, you weren't paying attention to the right data set, which is tough. It's tough to it's nuanced, and it's not necessarily something that people want to hear or see. They want everything to go up all the time, and they don't want things to go down. And yeah, so I mean, this is where we're at. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to research it. It's a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of books. I'd have to identify the books to evaluate, right? So I'd have to probably let me framework it. And then, if you have comments, share them with me about whether or not this is worthy, because it would take a while. And, this is one of those things where like the channel gets big enough and I can afford, justify hiring somebody. This would be the sort of thing that I would hand to somebody. Take the top 10, top 20 golden age books, top 10 silver age books, top 10 copper age books, and look at the trend lines, like look at the sales, see which ones did have bubble results, which ones didn't, where the trend lines are, do an analysis that way. I mean, the thing is, like, I don't know what it's going to tell us that would actually be actionable. It would be interesting, for sure, which is why I'm spitballing it now. But I think generally, the guess that I have is probably the shape of the data, like after we analyzed it. It's probably pretty close. Like I've looked a lot of those charts, like those moving averages in GPA look like a hockey stick and then a cliff, like between 2021 and 23. That's just the way that they look, all of them. Anything that has a lot of sales results looks like that. So hopefully you thought this was interesting. I certainly did. It's been something that's been on my mind for a little while, and I wanted to share something about it. And this is a perfect place to do it, right? It's just kind of me musing and sharing thoughts before they're even really real. I mean, I might look back on this in a week and think I'm crazy. I don't actually think that's going to happen. These weren't half-baked thoughts, but they're not fully baked either. So there is some chance that something I said in this podcast isn't going to end up being official. It's all just comics party line. But it probably is. I mean, honestly, it's like, being pragmatic, looking at the current state of the market, like acknowledging the bubble, but, not hanging the hobby on it, right? Like, not like looking at it and saying, well, if it doesn't sell for what it sold for in 2021, the sky is falling, right? The sky's not falling. I mean, it is what it is. The growth of the hobby since CGC came onto the scene is phenomenal. And, at the end of the day, this will all smooth out over time. So I hope, actually, I mean, it's not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed in this world, but I hope it'll smooth out over time. And with that, yeah, I think I'm done. I could probably talk about this for a little while and run off on like 5 more tangents, but it's getting near dinner time as I record this. So I'm gonna go. I'm gonna have a drink and I make some dinner, and then I'm going to work tomorrow. So yeah, I mean, this is how life goes. But in the interim, thank you for checking this out. And yeah, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, leave some comments. What you think about this as a research subject, whether it's worth tackling. Um, And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye.